President Trump says this is not his war. Okay, end all further aid to this government in Ukraine and pull us out. Get all the Americans that are in Ukraine, military or otherwise, intelligence, civilian, they all leave.
So recently, Douglas Macgregor was on Andrew Napolitano's podcast talking about the current situation in Ukraine, why the war is continuing, and what it would take to end it, and why Trump, in some ways, is echoing some of the same status quo policies as the Biden administration as it continued to aid Ukraine. This one ought to be interesting, so let's watch and let's react.
Do you think the Americans understand the Kremlin's mentality that it would not and hasn't historically stopped fighting for the purpose of negotiating, that it has conducted both negotiations and fighting at the same time? And secondly, that it will hold fast to its initial demands, which were part of the agreement in Istanbul and which it expects to achieve by the special military operation?
I think the easy answer is no. I don't think we have the slightest idea how the Russians think about their country and about this war. That's one of the major problems. We have a bad habit of projecting onto the Russians an intellectual framework or a cultural framework, which is our own. And as a result, it's very hard for us to understand them. I mean, they are willing to negotiate, but keep in mind, we are a co-belligerent. We're in no position to mediate a solution or an agreement of any kind. We are part of the problem. So they're happy to talk to us, but they're not going to cease operations until we demonstrate conclusively that the Ukrainians and we will respect the initial position that they've always taken. So until we do that, nothing will change. And I don't see much evidence that we're going to do what is required. I think we're already talking about walking away from it. At least that's my impression from the things that Mr. Rubio has said and Vice President Vance has said.
That's so key to this whole thing. Russia believes that the U.S. is a co-belligerent in this, or the primary belligerent, because the U.S. is the entity which started several waves of NATO expansion, the overthrow of the Yanukovych government, the placement of the Aegis missile system that can fire Tomahawks with an H-bomb on the top of them on essentially the border of Russia. And he's so right about projecting onto Russia many of the things that the U.S. government is guilty of, essentially nation building. They say Putin wants to reconstitute the Soviet Union. Well, it's the U.S. government that's been guilty of empire building and expanding military presence through every corner of the world, opening up new military bases, getting involved in regime change operations and proxy wars, of which Ukraine is an example, etc. So he is spot on about that.
Here's what President Putin had to say after the conversation with President Trump. I thought he was very astute, saying our key objectives have always been the same: to identify the root causes of this military operation. Chris, cut number 8.
The President of the United States and I agreed that Russia can and is ready to work with Ukraine on a memorandum on the possible eventual future peace treaty by addressing a number of provisions, including we need to set forth the principles and the deadlines for achieving a peace deal, and this includes the possible cessation of hostilities for a specific period of time if we reach specific agreements. This gives us hope that overall we're headed in the right direction. This was a very constructive conversation. I think that both Russia and Ukraine must do everything to contribute to peace, and they must find the compromises that would suit all the parties involved. I would like to say that overall, Russia's position is clear. Our key objective is to identify the root causes of this crisis.
We all know what the Russian objective is. He stated it before the war started. It was restated again in the agreement that the Russians and the Ukrainians agreed to before Joe Biden and Boris Johnson talked then lawfully President Zelensky out of it. We all know what those agreements were. Is there any reason to think that Vladimir Putin would change his mind? He's on the cusp of a military victory.
No, I don't think so. But there's also no reason to expect that Mr. Zelensky is going to accept those conditions. He's not going to accept the permanent incorporation of the eastern oblasts into Russia, along with the legitimate ownership of Crimea in Russian hands. He said that repeatedly. So, under those circumstances, it's hard to imagine anything good coming out of this, although I think President Trump has a habit of hearing what he wants to hear. And I think he heard a willingness to end the war, which is clear. Nobody in Russia wants this war to go on in perpetuity, least of all Vladimir Putin. They've lost 120, 130,000 killed. I don't know how many wounded. The Ukrainian losses, of course, are much higher, probably 1.5 million killed in action. How many wounded is anybody's guess. But Zelensky's in no mood to accommodate anything connected with Russia's core position.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like Russia's preferences and Russia's position hasn't really differed in any substantial way since 2021, when Putin sent to NATO a draft treaty saying, if you just put it in writing, I won't invade Ukraine. And then you have Jens Stoltenberg out there boasting about how we laughed at this and we threw this idea to the wayside, and now Putin has a war. And he boasts about that. I don't think their position has changed much since then, except for claims over the Donbas territory that they now occupy, which wasn't one of his demands in that draft treaty in 2021, and it wasn't part of his attempted negotiation of peace with Zelensky in the early months of the war in Istanbul, the agreement that by some accounts was essentially signed almost until Boris Johnson and the U.S. talked Zelensky out of accepting it. So that's totally accurate. By the way, did anyone else catch the guy that walked into the frame while Putin was talking? That was kind of funny. But anyways, I don't think Russia's position has changed much outside of, recognition of the Donbas territory, which was at the crux of the dispute over the Minsk agreements to end the civil war that was happening within Ukraine between kind of the Russian culturally oriented eastern part in the Donbas and Ukraine. The Minsk agreements would have had Ukraine recognize special autonomy in those regions, not only in law but also in the Ukrainian constitution, and they didn't decide to entertain them whatsoever. It's not even clear whether they ever intended to, even though that they signed on to it.
Well, then there will be no amicable resolution of this. It'll be a military resolution, or there'll be some new government in Ukraine that will resolve it by treaty.
Well,
Very
Judge,
obvious.
Judge, it's also pretty clear if you look at the numbers of discontented officers and soldiers in the Ukrainian army, that if fighting were to stop in eastern Ukraine for any length of time, I think tens of thousands of Ukrainian veterans would turn their attentions to Zelensky in Kiev. And I don't think he would survive it. I think there's great bitterness right now in the field towards the regime in Kiev. And they hold him responsible for these massive losses and dramatic failures. I don't think there's an understanding of that in the Trump administration at all.
Yeah, it's hard to know exactly what the situation and the cultural dynamics are in that regard, but we know that there is massive resistance against the expansive conscription mandates in Ukraine, and it seems as though Zelensky fears the right-wing elements within his country, the ones that are nationalistic forces that, really pushed him toward this war alongside Boris Johnson and the U.S., that he might fear quite a bit more than Putin, because Putin seems willing to end this war conditionally. The conditions might not be to his liking, but Zelensky isn't going to get what he was offered in Istanbul in 2022. It's just an impossibility in this regard, especially when it comes to Crimea and the Donbas regions. He's not getting those back.
they understood that, they would go back and do what we've urged them to do from the very beginning. President Trump says this is not his war. Okay, end all further aid to this government in Ukraine and pull us out. Get all the Americans that are in Ukraine, military or otherwise, intelligence, civilian, they all leave. All he's done by failing to do that is extend the Biden policy, sadly.
Hate to say I agree there. I mean, for all the rhetoric Trump had during the campaign season and the rhetoric that he uttered in the face of Zelensky when Zelensky was in the White House, the U.S. is primarily continuing on the Biden status quo path of arming Ukraine. Now, will they go back to Congress and ask for another aid package for Ukraine and push for it and Trump whip his supporters in that direction? I don't think so, but it's sad that it's not fully known the answer to that right now. I mean, all Trump has to do is step away from this thing and the U.S. is disinvolved, but the military-industrial complex is in his ear. The neocons like Waltz used to be, and Rubio and Kellogg is in his ear over this. They want this to continue because of the lucrative flow of money to the military-industrial complex.
You know, he said it as recently as yesterday, and it irritates me when he says it because he should accept responsibility for the war that he's funding. Chris, cut number 9.
This was not my war. This is not a war that would have happened if I were president. This is not my war. I'm just here to try and help. We've spent hundreds of billions of dollars on this war, and yet that's not. Frankly, we made much more than that just in 4 days in the Middle East. It's a lot of money, but we do much. This is about thousands of people dying every single week. 5,000, 6,000 people dying every single week. You know, these soldiers, they say goodbye in Ukraine and in Russia, and then their parents never see them again, except maybe in pictures of horrible scenes, because I've seen some scenes, I've never seen anything like it. So we're going to see if we can get it taken care of. Yep.
I mean, much of this is just irresponsible for him to say it's not his war, but 5,000 to 6,000 people have died. That's 60 to 65,000 people since he became president. How long would Ukraine last if Trump says to Hegseth, close the spigot, stop sending them weapons and ammunition?
I suspect a few weeks at most. You know, they're in very dire straits as it is right now. But, you know, President Trump seems to lack self-awareness, Judge. He doesn't seem to grasp that he is monumentally responsible for this war continuing. Our cash, our equipment continues to pour in. The recent attacks or attempted attacks on the 9 May celebration in Red Square consisted of ATACMS missiles. They didn't show up magically on their own. They didn't come from Great Britain or Germany. They're ours. Surely he must understand that.
Didn't?
Doesn't make sense.
Yeah, isn't it crazy, too, how not only did the Biden administration, but also the Trump administration want you to believe that this entire conflict began yesterday? If Trump was fully savvy politically, he would say, no, this was the consequence of waves of NATO expansion and the U.S. role in overthrowing the government under the Obama administration in an ordeal that Victoria Nuland and Biden played a role in, and we need to stop it. But instead, Trump actually supplied Ukraine with, I think, $300 million or $400 million in weaponry in 2019 or 2018. I forget which year. And the Democrats were saying, well, hey, you can't withhold this payment, because his instincts was to withhold it at first, or we're going to impeach you. Well, eventually he relinquished his claim on withholding the armaments. The armaments were sent to Ukraine, and they still impeached him. And as of a few months ago, he still boasted about supplying them with javelins. Hey, you know, Biden didn't supply them with these anti-tank javelins like I did. So Trump was somewhat responsible at the time. Was he as culpable as the Obama administration and Biden. No, it's not on the same level as that, but he does bear some responsibility for this too. And to call it Biden's war is a half-truth. Now, the rest of his rhetoric in that statement was good. I've seen some horrific things. People want to end the fighting. I'm just trying to help here. That is great rhetoric, but it's not going to be consequential unless it's followed with actions.
Didn't the first Trump administration, this is what he was impeached over, as ill-advised as the impeachment was, send an enormous amount of military equipment to Ukraine? I'm talking about 2017 to 2021. Joe Biden wasn't president, Trump was.
Yes. He consistently fails to remember that. I don't think he ever grasped what was really happening on the ground in Ukraine. This was presented to him as more foreign aid and military assistance to a future NATO member. What does he know about Ukraine? Nothing. What does he know about Russia? Frankly, nothing. So again, you get this transactional response. Look at all the money we just effectively garnered during our trip to Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. We'll set aside whether or not that's actual and real. And just think about that statement. And we've lost hundreds of billions in Ukraine. What is going on here? You know, this is not the art of the deal. We're talking about national interests and the survival of peoples and nations. It doesn't seem to sink in with him at all.
Yeah, had to agree with Colonel Macgregor here. Well said. A lot of Trump's rhetoric on Ukraine was very good, but other than opening up diplomatic channels with Russia, which is good, he deserves credit for that, we're seeing a lot of the same policies. Despite all the theatrics, all of, you know, the horror stories in the corporate media about how Trump disrespected the freedom fighter Zelensky, who, by the way, is an autocrat totalitarian that's banned political opposition, adversarial media, and even certain churches within Ukraine, expanded conscription, etc. That's no freedom fighter, trust me. But Trump hasn't matched a lot of his rhetoric with actions that it would take to actually end U.S. involvement. I think it's because he wants to be the architect of a peace deal, but that can't really happen as long as Russia views the U.S. as a belligerent, which it clearly does. I'm glad they're willing to talk to us, but the U.S. is bankrolling this war. And I think Macgregor's also right that I don't think Trump fully understood the situation in Ukraine in his first term. He had people like Pompeo and John Bolton in his ear telling him to throw as much money as possible to aid them. His instincts were good on withholding that armament payment or armament supply to Ukraine, but then he eventually caved on that. And I do think he was trying to evade impeachment, but he got impeached anyways, so hindsight's always 20/20, but that's what happened there. But what do you think is the biggest impediment to peace in Ukraine? I want to hear from you in the comments down below. Leave me a comment in the description, and do you agree with Colonel Macgregor? And please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.